Welcome back to Sociology 226. This is Patricia Hill Collins, Video 1. This video is going to be structured a little differently than the others. In order to understand Hill Collins' black feminist thought, we have to understand the feminist sociological tradition that she was critiquing. So, I'll begin with the life and work of Patricia Hill Collins, and then we'll move to Dorothy Smith, the famous Canadian feminist sociologist. Understanding Hill Collins' critique of Smith will get you ready to do the readings. A note, before we do any of this, on positionality. This is a white guy from Saskatchewan giving you a lecture on intersectional feminism. This is not lost on me. However, I think that there are at least 3 reasons why we should read intersectional feminist sociology. First, it's important. Full stop. Second, intersectional feminist sociology makes us think about power, authority, exclusion, inequality, all the things that sociologists have been thinking about since the origins of the discipline. Reading it makes our sociological imagination better. Finally, it's really interesting. Let's get started. Patricia Hill Collins grew up the single child of a working-class family, her father a veteran of World War II. She attended public school in Philadelphia, eventually making it to Brandeis University. Here, she noted that no matter how far she could prove herself as a working-class student, opportunity and reality became more distinct. My world grew larger, but I felt I was growing smaller, she writes in the preface to Black Feminist Thought. Regardless, she receives a master's degree from Harvard in social science education, teaching in Boston for years before returning to do her PhD at Brandeis in 1980. She joined the University of Cincinnati in 1982 at the Department of African American Studies, staying there for 26 years. Her most famous book, Black Feminist Thought, which I will explore in further detail in the next video, came out in 1990. The second edition is available online via the library catalog. I suggest you download it. It includes the social problems paper assigned for 226. Part of the book involves a critique of the existing feminist sociology represented by Dorothy Smith. Critiquing isn't the same as criticism. In this sense, Patricia Hill Collins is not disregarding the existing feminist tradition, inasmuch as she is saying, who gets to count as a feminist? What counts as a feminist act? And most importantly, where does race and racialization fit into all of this? For these very important and timely questions, Patricia Hill Collins was elected president of the American Sociological Association, the first black woman so elected. Of course, what matters is not solely her position in American sociology, prestigious as it may be, but the power and the force of her concepts. To understand black feminist thought, we need to look to the existing feminist sociology being done while Hill Collins was writing it. This means looking to famous Canadian feminist sociologist Dorothy Smith. Smith is born 1926 in England. She attends the London School of Economics and meets her husband, to then move to the United States to do a PhD at Berkeley. As a sociologist, she found very little of her life as a mother and a wife to be represented in the kinds of thought that she was being trained to learn. She's the mother of 2 and gets divorced. Smith finds her own material existence at odds with the sociology that purports to theorize it. Here, she thinks alongside Karl Marx. I want to emphasize 2 distinct components in Dorothy Smith's career, as a very important sociologist in her own right, as well as a critic of the sociological tradition that we've explored thus far. That is, while giving us a way to think about society, she shares with Michel Foucault a worry about the way that sociological work has contributed to the exclusion of a great many from systems of power. Smith's The Conceptual Practices of Power explores how texts organize and often distort the lived experience of gendered subjects. Not just distort, but shape. A police report, for instance, both represents reality and shapes it. We can see this approach is very similar to that of Harold Garfinkel. Thus, I've given you her focus on texts, ideology, and institutions, and her concepts of women's standpoint and ruling relations. Smith teaches at Berkeley for a bit, starts a women's studies program at UBC, and then moves to the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education until her retirement. Currently, Smith is an adjunct professor, University of Victoria. For us, 2 of Dorothy Smith's concepts are crucial. The first is a women's standpoint, or the standpoint. Smith takes the notion of a standpoint from feminist thinker Sandra Harding, but develops it in relation to the sociological canon in ways that Harding does not. This is why I've attributed to her as a sociologist. If you've taken gender studies classes, and I hope you do if you haven't, Smith usually gets lumped in with a group of thinkers on so-called standpoint epistemology, or standpoint theory. Epistemology is a $10 word that refers to the theory of knowledge. Smith argues that women have a unique position in the material organization of society, at the intersection of the domestic and formal work economy, and that theorizing this unique position gives us particular insights that we don't receive for others who exist in other places. Because the material environments where men and women work are different, and because we tend to think wholly in terms of the latter rather than the former, women's experience, existence, and lives tend to be erased from the sociological map. The second and related concept is of the ruling relations. Here we need to think in terms of ruling or governing in the kinds of ways that Foucault does. Any institution is in the business of ruling. This can be a physical institution, like a bank, or it can be a social institution, like marriage or capitalism. Any institution involves practical human life unfolding and reproducing itself. Smith is interested in how practical human life is organized in such a way that reproduces particular forms of power. A crucial component here is text. Textual descriptions of human action are not benign descriptions of that action. They are power-laden and often exclusionary. Smith is interested in how textual accounts of practical social life shape, alter, and maintain institutions. Here, she focuses on what she calls official text producers, those with the power to describe life in text and with the power to use that text to maintain institutional order. This is a gendered process. By looking to how texts shape institutions and how institutions operate through them, Smith is not just telling us how to do sociology, she's also providing us a critique of sociology. Smith shares Foucault's belief that sociology reproduces dominant relations of ruling. However, they argue this in very different ways. For Foucault, sociology is part of the ruling relations because knowledge of population helped constitute population as a thing. Think about the census, one way that sociology has come to constitute population as an object of governance. Smith will take a different tactic. She's going to argue that sociology is an example of an institutional space that organizes experience into categories, into subjective states and objective social relations in ways that justifies the gendered world we live in. The first of these is the presumption of men as subjects in sociological discourse. When we read Goffman, when we read Durkheim and Weber, and certainly when we read Marx, we find the term he, him, and man a lot. Smith will argue that the basic unit of analysis in sociological discourse is a man. Smith is also going to argue that it isn't simply the nouns that we need to worry about in sociological discourse, he, him, and man, but also the various accounts for motivation of actors that we deploy in causal explanations of action. So verbs, action. Any sociological account, says Smith, is one that grants agency, capacity, and subjectivity to the people it is talking about. Agents act in particular conditions that shape their action. This is the case for Marx, for Durkheim, for Weber, for Parsons. You get the point. Smith argues that sociological inquiry, as an explanatory theory of human life, takes abstract motivations for actions, one, that annihilate the gendered way in which we dwell in the world and the bodies in which we dwell in the world. It is no small wonder why she couldn't find herself as a single mother in the sociology of public life, because public life and living in public is something that alienates the lived experience of the home. Sociology reproduces the relations of ruling by selecting subjects, man, and objects, men's labor, and motivations for labor, gender-free, at the expense of women's lives. And of so many others. There is no sociological subject in everyday experience. Making up that kind of person means counting in particular bodies and counting others out. Here I quote, "Sociology's conceptual procedures, methods, and relevances organize its subject matter from a determinate position in society. As it is now, these strategies separate a sociologically constructed world from that of direct experience. It is precisely that separation that must be undone. The goal, then, is to make a sociology that doesn't simply exclude people for not fitting its pre-existing notion of what humans are and how they act. The goal is a sociology unfolding from women's actual lives." But where does Patricia Hill Collins fit in? We'll return to her work next. I would suggest that there are three key aspects to Hill Collins' critique. 1. Patricia Hill Collins is going to ask about the kind of people we take to represent women in feminist theory, and men, it should be noted, and the relations that we presume between them. 2. She's going to ask about the presumed form that feminism would take, mostly essays, public awareness campaigns, and civic action, and who those types of actions are most often taken by. 3. And finally, she's going to ask us to challenge some of the founding dualisms on which sociology and feminist thinking have implicitly taken on, even if they don't know it. Here, she's asking about divisions between genders, sexes, races, and the different spheres of everyday life. As I said, we'll address the contributions you see listed in the next video after you do the readings. For the critiques, we have an overview, but now let's get our hands dirty. First, the idea of the standpoint. First and foremost is the challenge to the belief that there exists a single standpoint from which women can explore their exclusion. If the argument found in Smith is that the place within the relations of ruling determines standpoint, this is a pretty easy concept to prove. White women are not in the same situation as black women, argues Patricia Hill Collins. We simply do not have the same position within the relations of ruling. The notion of a standpoint for women, of men, of the proletariat, this simply doesn't account for the complexity of the world in which we all live. There are distinct stereotypes applied to black women that white women don't have to address. There are very real and distinct socioeconomic conditions that racialized people dwell within, and to speak of a single women's movement based on a single women's standpoint is an analytical oversight. Looking for a single standpoint reproduces marginalization, as certain voices are louder than others. Our job is to account for this complexity. Rather than raising consciousness, black feminist thought affirms and re-articulates a consciousness that already exists. The goal, then, is not making a shared standpoint apparent, but understanding that multiple and diverse standpoints already exist, should we care to go looking for them. Next, Hill Collins looks to discourse. Black feminist thought asks us to define what exactly we take as feminist action and discourse, and the type of standpoint we presume in taking this to be so. Think pieces, public addresses, courses in the sociology of race and gender, and mass political mobilization are perfectly fine ways to express the nature of the feminist project. However, if we take these particular types of acts to be the only acts that constitute empowerment, then we miss so many of the ways that black communities have resisted marginalization and oppression. Particularly important here is the emphasis on the politics of speech and representation. Not only is the importance on the type of speech that unfolds from a particular standpoint, Collins argues convincingly that black communities have historically emphasized oratorical skills alongside the written word. Collins also explores the type of positions of power and authority that emerge within the black community. So yes, we get heroes like Gloria Steinem or Jackie Robinson, etc., but the positions of authority and speech emerging in the black community are for mothers, grandmothers, teachers, and others, positions that women occupy in ways not found in other cultural enclaves, and not those we see in white feminist discourse. Not just collective circumstances, then, at the expense of all else. We must also explore the standpoint of the individual speaker, such as the argument expressed in her 1990 book. Ultimately, there are black women in positions of power in their communities who empower other members, who maintain social solidarity, who speak and act on their behalf, and these people have previously done and continue to do so. Those people are passed over in the dominant white feminism, not because they can't speak, but because we haven't listened. Last is Collins' challenge to either-or thinking. Patricia Hill Collins argues that Smith's feminist project is unfortunately captive to the same philosophical tradition, the same theory of knowledge or epistemology that has dominated all of the other sociologies that we've studied in this course. She argues that the kind of dualistic, oppositional thinking that you see on the slide has failed to capture the cultural expressions whereby black women have acted in resistance to dominant forces of exclusion, and, as Smith argues, contribute to those relations of ruling that have passed over black women as agents in social life. Simply stating the battle lines of feminism between men and women, for example, has caused us to pass over the knowledge and experience of black women and black men. These are ideal types, despite how much Smith will want to critique the sociological tradition and their unquestioned use has caused this to be so. We are forced to pick a side, and one side at that. We're going to see in the following video how Collins will take these oppositional, dualistic modes of thinking and combine them into a both-and framework to make sure that the sociology of race and gender and feminist theory doesn't pass over the lives of the women that we must consider if we're going to be inclusive in our theorization of oppression and anti-oppressive practice. Let's summarize these three critiques and wrap up this video. So, together we can see that Collins challenges Smith's feminism on 3 points. First, she asks how coherent a single standpoint is for expressing the situation of women. She asks what form discourse takes and who is the presumed speaker in that situation, and she challenges the simplistic model of ideology, ruling, and oppression that dominates Smith's thought. Most importantly, and in sum, she points out that there are relations of ruling within feminist discourse, no matter how much we might deny that fact. Now, we needn't agree with her on every point, but such is the position reached in the piece quoted here. Smith's work is extremely valuable in challenging the rules of sociological method on its own terms. But moving closer to the inner circle means that one participates in the very relations of ruling which Smith abhors. Of course, we shouldn't ignore that there are very real continuities between these two forms of thought. Both of them share the same critique of the sociological canon, subtracting the living, breathing experiences of groups in a particular standpoint. Both Smith and Collins would emphasize this and agree that something has to be done. But the point made here is that Smith causes problems with her solution, something that black feminist thought aims to address. Now it's your turn to read some of it.